And the bottom line is, while the world is outraged, I don't think anybody is surprised because Israel is acting true to form. I mean, robbers will rob, rapists will rape, and Israel commits war crimes. That's been its history. But I think what Americans are really angry about right now, and I'm getting this basically when my wife and I went shopping for groceries yesterday, we were talking to just the ordinary people in the supermarket. They were aware of what was going on. And their attitude was, well, we expect Israel to do this. But they were waiting for the U.S. government to take some kind of decisive action regarding the 9 U.S. citizens who were kidnapped in international waters by this act of war. And now we're seeing, the U.S. once again at the United Nations Security Council is trying to stifle criticism of Israel and is working to protect Israel. And as far as those U.S. citizens in Israeli prisons, apparently they're not important. Now, this is a far cry from 1904 when a businessman named Ion Pertikaris was kidnapped in Morocco by a gentleman by the name of Raisuli. And President Theodore Roosevelt sent 7 battleships with orders to invade Morocco if Pertikaris was not ultimately returned, which he was. And I think the American people are wondering whose side is the federal government on when, this week we're coming up again on the anniversary of the attack on the USS Liberty, where Israel killed all these American sailors, and then President Johnson not only did not hold Israel to account, but participated in this cover-up of saying, oh, it's just an accident and so forth and so on. And we're seeing a repeat of that sellout once again. And at this point, and I've been saying this entire election season, America needs leaders who are going to put America first, second, and third, and a government cannot serve 2 masters. If we have a government that is serving Israel, they cannot serve the best interests of the American people. And you only need to look around at our crumbling infrastructure and our destroyed economy and all the other evils that have descended upon the United States of America under the guidance of a government that is still sending money to Israel, even though the British press just published documents proving that Israel is not only a nuclear power, they've been trying to sell nuclear warheads to regimes like apartheid South Africa. And billions of dollars of our tax money continue to pour into Israel, even though it's illegal to do so under U.S. law because of those nuclear weapons. And the American people are starting to say, okay, whose side is the government on?
Well, let me ask this question. I mean, the situation with all these countries threatening potential war with Israel, namely Turkey. Turkey says they're going to dispatch warships with the next flotilla that's set to leave in the next day or so. I mean, is Israel going to attack Turkish warships?
I think they very well might. I mean, culturally and nationally, Israel is never able to back down. They're never ever able to admit error. If they let this next flotilla through to Gaza and nothing bad happens because of it, then Israel is going to be seen for having been wrong to have imposed such a blockade for the last going on 4 years, in defiance of a UN resolution, I might add. The United Nations has repeatedly, including the Security Council, called on Israel to lift the blockade. Israel refuses to do so. And so I think that, yes, if Turkey sends armed warships to escort the aid fleet, there may be a shooting war between Israel and Turkey. And I want to point out one more thing. Turkey is a member of NATO. Yes, so is Israel. But Israel has attacked a NATO nation over this last weekend. And under the rules of the NATO treaty, an attack on one NATO nation is an attack on them all. So every member of NATO has been attacked by Israel under the terms of that contract. I am waiting for the NATO nations, in particular the United States of America, to stand up and say, you are not allowed to attack NATO.
Now, going back here, Mike, I do think, though, there's spin on both sides, because you have the pro-Gaza group on the news saying we didn't fight back in any way, and then it's not true that we were beating people with poles and trying to stab them. But there are images of people running around with knives, and there are images of people beating the commandos on the head with poles. And it does, at least at those points, look like the Israelis are being restrained while they're being attacked with poles. I agree. It's wrong to attack the ships. I mean, it's wrong to take them over. It's wrong to have the blockade to stop them. My issue is, though, I think the Arabs lose some credibility here when their media puts out that nobody was attacking the commandos, when their own live feeds show it clear as day.
Okay, well, I think we're dealing with a problem with the translation, because what the Arab media is saying, Israel claimed that the people on board the aid fleets attacked first. that the commandos just set foot on the deck and they weren't doing anything bad, and then the crew of the ship just attacked them. Now, in my point of view, they were justified in attacking the invading force at that point anyway. What the Arab media is saying is that it wasn't until the Israelis started firing first, that's when the sticks and poles and knives got picked up, and the melee basically got under.
All right, stay there. We got a break. Let's come back and cover all that on the other side with Mike Rivero. Well, Mike brings up the central point that I've made several times in the first hour. And watching that one live feed that got out that's been on Al Jazeera, Press TV, Fox, CNN, hundreds of different local TV stations, scores of international networks, and we're going to continue to roll that in the background. In fact, I'll probably just play one of the reports, unedited coming up because we've got some clips here that are from start to finish with the Press TV reporters and others out on the deck. And you do hear banging and exploding in the minutes and seconds before the boarding. And that actually fits with how ships are normally boarded during a blockade. They fire tear gas, they fire flashbangs, they fire across the bow, the ship won't stop. Then the ship finally gets scared. It runs the flag up, and the Arabs and the pro-Palestinian group, they say, yeah, we ran the white flag up. Then the Israeli commandos come down because the ship has surrendered, and then the people attack them. So there's no doubt that the Israelis attacked the ship with flashbangs and with tear gas. But the big issue is, and the problem is, Israel has the ships and can cover this up. If Israel fired real ammunition into the ship, there is no doubt this was illegal. Mike Rivera?
Well, you need to remember that what Israel calls a rubber bullet is not what the United States calls a rubber bullet. The Israeli rubber bullets still have steel cores, and they are lethal at close distance. And the bottom line here is, again, Israel can make up any statements it wants about why it wants to stop the aid fleet, but they have never, ever once found any evidence of weapons going into Gaza. The ship was carrying construction supplies to repair the damage from cast lead, was carrying food, medical supplies, crayons, toys for the kids. All of these ships' cargoes were inspected at their ports of departure. Israel is basically throwing a tantrum and saying, you have to do what we tell you to do anywhere in the world. And you need to remember, Israel doesn't have the legal authority to issue orders to ships flying foreign flags in international waters. And again, Israel is just, making up these stories to justify continuing this blockade of Gaza, to try and starve the Gazan people into leaving because Israel covets their land. This has been the agenda for the last 4 years. Israel is putting out all this propaganda to justify what is, in essence, unjustifiable. They're still coming out with this canard that Hamas took control of Gaza with a violent coup. They didn't. Hamas won the election. But Israel doesn't want to admit the election happened anymore because Israel believes in democracy only when their people can win. And they support the Palestinian Authority because the Palestinian Authority is so far basically just rolling over and allowing the West Bank settlements to continue and allow the encroachment of more, land grab. And basically what is left of Palestine is dissolving before the eyes of the Palestinian people. All of this is in defiance of United Nations resolutions. And I remember back in 2003, when we were sending our young men and women to go in and attack Iraq over weapons of mass destruction that Israel claimed they had, and they didn't have them, we were being told that the reason we were doing this was because Iraq was defying the United Nations. Well, now we have Israel defying the United Nations. And what does the United States government do? They stand up in the Security Council and say, oh, we can't criticize Israel for what they did. And it's just, it's angering to see the government of the United States of America so much supportive of the government of Israel.
Well, let me ask this. What's going to happen when the Turks send warships in? I mean, is Israel going to attack them?
I think Israel very well might. Israel cannot admit error. They cannot back down. I think there's going to be a confrontation at sea, and the whole region may blow up because Syria and Lebanon and all these other countries are saying Israel has started a new regional war.
And now you just said it. You just said it. Perfect timing. In Asia, we've got the Korea blow up between North and South with the torpedo, which is very suspicious. We'll talk about that when we come back. Separately, you've got the Middle East blowing up. You've got Iraq, setting fire again. You've got escalations in Pakistan and Afghanistan. Right as the central banks collapse Europe and the United States, right as the G20 is openly announcing the birth of world government, magically the wars start. Mike, how many times have we talked about in the last year that they're going to have wars, and the Rand Corporation said 2 years ago that they need wars all over the planet to bring in the world government, and that only a new world war can do it, and it looks like it's being delivered on a silver platter.
Yes, by Israel, and we need to keep that in mind here, because one of the problems we have with all of our previous wars are that the nations that really start them very often skip out sideways and the blame falls on a third party. And we need to remember, Israel is the author of this new global disaster.
Well, they let past aid ships in. Why did they stop this? We'll be right back with Mike Rivero.